Hare Krishna, everybody. Welcome to our second episode of the Many Moons podcast. First of all, wanted to thank everybody for all the support we've received for our following our first episode. Sorry, 2 weeks ago. Thank you very much for tuning in to watch us, for all your lovely comments, feedback, and your support. Really, it's very much appreciated. And today we've got a very special session with RAMBHORU Prabhu on the gift of grieving, which is a very deep topic, but we've got a very expert in the field who very kindly agreed to be in our presence today. So just wanted to also mention we very much want to keep this session a interactive session. So please do put any comments or questions you have on the comment sections, whether you're watching us on YouTube or on Facebook, and we will be looking at these comments throughout the session to pick those up and put those to RAMBHORU Prabhu. And hopefully let's make this a very interactive and informative session. So I'm now gonna hand over to my co-host Sharadia to introduce our very special guest speaker today, and then we can get started.
Hare Krishna and good evening, everyone. As Dee said, we're very fortunate to have RAMBHORU Prabhu with us tonight. Every time that I communicate with her, I'm always struck by how busy she is and how much she does. So we're very grateful, Prabhu, for you giving us your time. Many of you might know she is a disciple of Srila Prabhupada. She's also the director of the Institute of Vaishnava Studies chaplaincy program, the director and founder of Karuna Care Education, and the director of St. Camillus Center for Spiritual Care, which is an urban interfaith chaplaincy program. She is also the first Vaishnava to be certified as a chaplain educator, so she trains other chaplains. She also has, or that is the equivalent of a PhD in chaplain training. She was also the first Vaishnava to be certified as a professional chaplain by the Gold Star Association of Professional Chaplains. She also served in the adjunct faculty of the Patient Counseling Department at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she provided clinical pastoral education to chaplains in training. She has provided pastoral care education in diverse contexts such as the Los Angeles County University of Southern California Medical Centers, Merrington, Washington Hospital, prisons, hospices, military, gang rehabilitation centers, college campuses, and religious congregations. So she's worked with diverse religious groups as Christians, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, and of course also Hindus and Vaishnavas. She is also the creator and the coordinator of Hearts, a collaborative initiative focused on holistic emotional awareness, relational training and support. And she is also a certified grief recovery specialist and a certified grief support group facilitator. She is, of course, also an international speaker, and she focuses on topics as grief, bereavement, death and dying, self and other empowerment, community building, the ethics of individual and collective power and relationship. And she's also very passionate about advocating of Rupa Goswami's 6 loving exchanges, compassionate listening as the presence for cure of all personal and social ills. So we're very fortunate to have her with us. Someone that's been a devotee for many years, but at the same time also really specialized and very experienced in her field. So RAMBHORU Prabhu, this initiative that you have started, Karuna Care, I think it's very unique in what it offers to the devotee community. And as far as I know, there is nothing else like it available to the Vaishnava community. So could you share with us what inspired you to start Karuna Care, and what do you see as Karuna Care's main goal?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, I am getting older. I've done all this training and education, and at a certain point, devotees who didn't really know what I do, most people don't really know what is a chaplain and what is that, and why do you do that? Why do you just sit down and chant Hare Krishna to solve all your problems? And so as I got older, I realized that all the time and energy and money that I've spent on learning this skill and teaching Muslims and Buddhist rabbis and pastors and priests this skill. In response to devotees who said, well, why are you not teaching the ISKCON devotees? Why not them? Why everybody else? So I had two goals in mind. One was to download or to share whatever I had learned, because Prabhupada said, if we don't teach what we have learned, we become envious. It rots in our heart, this knowledge. And secondly, I noticed, as our movement grows, that we do a lot of talking about unconditional love as the essential principle of bhakti. And I have become aware that we talk a lot, but we don't know how to embody that. We talk a lot about love, but nobody knows how to do it. We don't know how to give love, and we don't know how to receive love. So my mission is, first of all, before I die, to somehow empower people to become pastoral care. We're calling ourselves Karuna Care chaplains because we want to move away from the Christian-centric terms pastoral, which is typically a shepherd. And in the profession, it's now called, instead of chaplains, they're moving to spiritual care providers as Buddhists and Hindus join this force of compassionate listening care. But my vision is that training people to not only do this work of compassionate listening care, which, by the way, is not therapy, but it's therapeutic, just to be listened to with compassion without judging and advising. And also I'm training people to facilitate grief support groups and training people to become chaplains. So it's kind of a pre-taster for devotees to feel themselves. What does it feel like? They may, as a result, decide, oh, I want to do this professionally. And in ISKCON right now, there's a growing interest in becoming a professional chaplain in order to make a living. If you're a young person and you want to have a family, you need to make money, but it aligns so nicely with our bhakti philosophy, so that you're not feeling like my occupation is somehow different or pulls me away from my bhakti practice. So that's my vision, is that trying to give devotees a avenue to become professionals and do this work as service and also as a living, make a living wage.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Prabhu. I'm aware that you want to share more specifically about how we can view grief as a gift. But before we go there, could you maybe just, for those of us that don't know, explain exactly what is a chaplain? Because as you yourself mentioned, many of us don't actually know what is a chaplain.
Well, a lot of times people I think we're counselors or coaches or mentors. And part of the reason is because we use many of the same dialogue, like active listening and certain things. We would call ourselves also crisis counselors because we are first responders. We might be on a police force or the fire department. I'm a Red Cross, an American Red Cross chaplain, disaster response, which means if there's a hurricane, a tornado, a fire or something, we would come in to try and help manage or bring the anxiety down and triage. So we are a blend of behavioral sciences, which is drawing from psychology, understanding human development, and what makes people do what they do, and also theology. So we may pray with people, we may read scripture with people, depending on their faith perspective. We're not there to force our theology or our views on other people, but we understand enough about all religions and human suffering that we can join people wherever they are. So we have no goal, different from a counselor who is basically trying to help people change their behavior. We're about unconditional love and acceptance. And we believe, different to maybe counselors or even psychotherapy, is that unconditional love alone, unconditional compassion alone already heals the human heart, unless you have some organic traumatic issue like bipolar or schizophrenia. That's a whole different ballgame. But generally, what we've seen is most mental distress is about isolation and loneliness and not being able to create heart connecting relationships. So we're focusing on that.
I think it's very, you described it very beautifully, and it's this need for, I mean, sometimes all people need is is somebody to listen to them, isn't it? And we've seen this time and time again, particularly with the pandemic,
Yeah.
particularly in the UK, mental health issues is so, has come into the forefront because of this whole pandemic and, isolation, like you just mentioned. So I think it, you trying to combine that from a not just a clinical perspective with psychological proper evidence, the idea of bringing that closer and linking that to bhakti is just such a beautiful and wonderful idea, honestly. So
Yeah.
and it's just much needed because I think when everybody, like you said, is so anxious these days, so I think it's such a good initiative.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But there's many thoughts that I have now. Only one thing that I'll say is that I think that it's very clear that the work that you're doing, you are approaching it from a different angle as a therapist would, a psychologist would. But I think what I'm hearing is that a lot of even devotees experience what I think is called love deprivation, where you're deprived of love. And I think
Yeah.
what you're describing is creating that space and where people can actually start feeling the love and also exchange the love with each other. So, and that then connects to our topic this evening, and that is grief and the gift of grieving. So, could you please, I know you've got a very thoughtfully prepared presentation, can you please start sharing with us what were your, after so many years of practice and experience, what were your thoughts and your realizations about this topic?
Okay. Well, let's get started. Let me get my notes. So, the gift of grieving. Yeah. Whenever I am asked to speak on this topic, I'm also asked to say something about the Bhagavad Gita verse where Krishna says to Arjuna, while speaking learned words, you are mourning for those not worthy of grief. The wise lament neither for the living nor the dead. That's such a popular, because it has this word grief in it. And in the verses leading up to this one, Arjuna is described as overwhelmed. His body is shaking in fear. He's imagining death and destruction about to happen in this impending war. And Arjuna's mouth is dry. He can't think straight. He's numb. His mind is reeling. And he's so overwhelmed that he becomes paralyzed. He's unable to move in any direction, which is exactly how we feel when we encounter a significant and sudden loss. So Prabhupada praises Arjuna, saying that a devotee's heart is naturally soft and compassionate because he doesn't want to hurt another living being. And Krishna tries to comfort Arjuna by reminding him that no matter what his material reality is, his spiritual identity is eternal, wise, and joyful, because he and everyone else he's caring for about in this battle, his family, they're also part and parcel of the all-pervading supreme spiritual consciousness who is a source of all infinite wisdom, joy, which we call Satchidananda. And therefore, we can't be destroyed, nor can anyone else. So Krishna's words are not an attempt to shut Arjuna down or dismiss his suffering, but he's affirming Arjuna's suffering, and his words are intended to help him transcend his grief. Krishna says, that which pervades the entire body you should know to be indestructible. No one is able to destroy the imperishable soul. And he who dwells in the body can never be slain. And therefore, you need not grieve for any living being. So scripture verses like these, they are codes meant to give us insights into universal truths about this world and to help us decide what our next steps should be in the best interests of ourselves and those people around us. Scripture calls us to consider reality at a particular time, in a particular place, and in a particular circumstance, so we know how best to move forward. And without considering these very specific aspects of a context, Scripture can be used as a weapon to harm rather than help us and others grow towards greater wholeness as living beings. So Prabhupada said that taking care of our health, both our mental and our physical health, is more important than chanting, because if we lose our health, we will be unable to chant or engage in devotional service. So when we neglect any aspect of our physical, emotional, intellectual, social, or spiritual selves, considering them to be illusion, we put ourselves at risk to misunderstand Vaishnava philosophy and harm ourselves and other people. As members of Krishna's transcendental body, we are servants of the Lord in our hearts and in the hearts of all others. And our bodies deserve the respect and care deserving of any of the Lord's temples. So sometimes as devotees, we do neglect or dismiss our gross and subtle bodies because we adhere to this philosophy of neti neti. You've probably heard this before. We think Brahman is not this, Brahman is not that, or God is not this, or God is not that. So, however, Prabhupada explains that to view anything separate from Krishna is Mayavad philosophy. So, Vaishnava philosophy, on the other hand, advocates that because God is present as the essence of all created things, everything should be used in his service. So using everything in Krishna's service is what it means to realize our relationship with God, and it is the essence of bhakti yoga. So when something breaks, whether it's a bone or a flat tire, there are specific methods for repairing or healing it. For example, to repair a broken bone, it requires it to be cast in a splint for about 6 to 8 weeks, so it will not be disturbed while it knits itself back together. To repair a flat tire might be a little more easy. We need some glue and some rubber to plug up the hole, and then we wait for it to adhere. But we can chant and chant and chant over the bone or the tire, and this will not repair or heal it without some other intervention. And in the same way, repairing a broken heart requires a specific method of healing that is unique unto itself. And this method we call grieving, the natural, normal, necessary process of mending the broken human heart following a significant loss. It could be a loss of another person through death. It could be a breakup in a relationship. It could be a loss of a body part, our health, our faith. So why do we grieve? Krishna says, "Time I am, and I have come to engage all people." So due to the time factor, which is the cause of all causes, everything in this created world is changing all the time. Time causes the process of our human development from the moment of conception to birth, to growth, to reproduction, remaining for some time and then dwindling, and finally the cause of our death. And none of us can stop it. Naturally, then, due to the constant changing nature of life, inevitably there will be losses. And because everything in this created world is temporary and not sustainable, there inevitably will also be grief, which is, again, the natural, normal, necessary feelings we experience following a significant loss. So most people assume that grief is simply a feeling of sadness. But actually, grief is a combination of all sorts of thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations that we typically experience following the loss of a person, place, or thing that we love, value greatly, or have attachment for. Often we experience grief feelings in response to a sudden life change that threatens our safety or our sense of security in some way. And all too often, family and friends will insist that we are grieving. When we are grieving, we should just get over it. If we express our grief beyond a year or two, or they assume we're feeling sorry for ourselves, or we're enjoying our suffering, or we're wallowing in our pain, or just on the mental platform. But what we know to be true from years of research is that grief is a long and arduous process of digesting, integrating, and healing the pain of loss, and that we never return to being the person we were before the loss. Our life is permanently changed. However, if we never allow ourselves to undergo this natural healing process of grieving, then we end up storing within ourselves a lifetime of unprocessed grief feelings that typically manifest as anartas or attitudes and behaviors that mask or cover over the unhealed parts of ourselves. If we don't recognize these attitudes and behaviors for what they are, undigested, unreconciled grief feelings, and remove these weeds through healthy mourning, then as we water our devotional creeper by chanting the holy name, we will also water these anartas. And they eventually strangle out our devotional creeper, preventing us from truly connecting with the Lord residing in our own hearts and the hearts of all living beings. So in the Srimad Bhagavatam, it explains, first, Brahma created ignorance by 5 types of his shadow: Tamishra, Andartamishra, Tamas, Moha, and Mahamoha. Avidya is the tendency to consider unreal objects as real, temporary objects as permanent, such as thinking our body is our true self. This ignorance is beginningless, anadi, and in the causeless cause of our eternal existence in the material world. Avidya gives rise to something called asmita, the attachment of our ego to our current body. Asmita gives rise to raga, our intense desire for accumulating material sense objects and our attachment to those objects. Raga gives rise to Dvesha, our desire to remove any obstacle that prevents us from accumulating sense objects. And avidya also gives rise to abhinivesha, our fear of death and fear of our body's destruction. So basically, avidya is our ignorance and avoidance of facing the reality of our death. So Krishna explains that fear arises when a living entity misidentifies themselves as the material body because of absorption in the external illusory energy of the Lord. And when the living entity thus turns away from the Supreme Lord, they also forget their own constitutional position as a servant of the Lord. This bewildering, fearful condition is affected by the potency for illusion called Maya. So, how can we free ourselves from these anartas? First of all, we have to acknowledge them for what they are. They are our means of defending against material lives, our material lives, our inspiration for struggling for survival in this world, and our way of avoiding the pain of grief we naturally feel due to the inevitable changes and losses we experience due to the all-controlling force of time. So basically, in order to free ourselves from our anartas or obstacles in devotional service, we have to face and surrender to the reality that all of us are dying every day, all the time, at every moment. Parts of our lives, ourselves, are dying and being recreated. And all these daily losses are Krishna's way of preparing us for the final loss of our gross and subtle bodies at the time of death. And as much as we hear about death in our Krishna philosophy, when we experience death or any significant loss, we're not prepared. And the pain of grief that naturally comes, we are surprised and confused by. We think there must be something wrong with us, or that the reason we are suffering is because there is something, we're not wise. Maybe we're in Maya. Maybe we're crazy. And then we feel a sense of shame. We may think that if we just chant and read more scripture, that the pain of grief will go away. And to be clear, chanting is the best medicine for our aching heart if we are able to chant the holy name with full attention. However, as Srila Prabhupada has said, we lose our health, mental or physical, when we have lost our health, mental or physical, then it may not be possible for us to chant with full attention. So we need to be compassionate on ourselves and acknowledge that we're grieving if we're struggling to chant. So this is an important insight to carry with us, that, yeah, sitting down and chanting with full attention, with tears in our eyes, with longing in our heart, that's a really great medicine. However, you may not, at a moment of sudden loss, in a grief mourning experience, be able to even chant, because our mind is in such a mental distress. So we need to be compassionate on ourselves and other persons who are experiencing significant loss. If our grief feelings are not acknowledged and tended to, they will become stronger and stronger until they will lead to some huge life crisis that forces us to face them, whether we like it or not. It could be a chronic illness or even a car accident. Now, in Kali Yuga, the age of quarrel and hypocrisy, all of us carry hurts and wounds that have caused us to develop behaviors and attitudes that protect, insulate, and prevent us from having heart-connecting personal relationship with Krishna, the source of our life, who resides in the hearts of ourselves and everyone else. And these behaviors distract us from being able to focus on spiritual practices and getting a taste for chanting the holy name. And these self-protecting attitudes and behaviors, which are basically animal propensities, keep us absorbed in body consciousness that focus our attention on eating, sleeping, mating, and defending, thinking that this is life's ultimate goal. So for us to move beyond self-preservation tendencies, we have to embrace, rather than run away from, the painful reality that we are dying, either today or tomorrow or in the next few minutes, and there's nothing we can do about it. So instead of resisting or fighting against the inevitability of our death, we can open our hearts and acknowledge that underneath all our losses is Krishna's loving presence, who is waiting to fulfill that void that is created when we lose anything we love, not just death, or anything that we love or are attached to in the material world. So as Krishna's devotees, the process of surrendering to our losses is part of the purification that softens our hearts that have been hardened since time immemorial due to our running away from Krishna in the form of time and inevitable change. And this pain of viewing our losses as separate from the Lord increases our feelings of isolation and loneliness. And this paralyzes us and makes us unable to love and be loved, because our heart is disconnected from Krishna, the source of all love. And by not honoring our grief, it will keep trying to get our attention until we have the courage to gently and in small doses open ourselves and move through it. Mourning our grief is our body's mechanism to help us digest and integrate our losses. It helps us cope with a loss and not become hard-hearted or hostile, which is what we often see in the lives of materialists. Through the process of mourning our grief, our spiritual nature as eternally wise, joyful beings is revealed. So grief inspires us to pause and withdraw from life's distractions and reflect on our purpose within life's ultimate goal. Grief slows us down and inspires us to seek in another direction to find the lasting happiness, meaning, and love we all yearn for. Digesting grief is a gradual process, and we must be patient with ourselves as we undergo the transformation of allowing parts of our lives to die in order to discover new parts of ourselves. It is an incarnational rebirthing process of letting go of what is no longer helpful for our spiritual growth and embracing what is. So, experiencing a new and changed wholeness in ourselves requires that we engage in the work of mourning. The mourning is expressing our grief feelings externally, outwardly, through any creative medium such as heart connecting conversations, reflective writing, singing, engaging in rituals, even gardening, any of the expressive arts, or being of service to others who are experiencing the pain of grief also. Mourning is a choice we make to open ourselves to the pain of our grief, which for many grievers is the moment that they realize that their hearts broke open, inspiring a major change in the way they understand life and their relationship with God. If we deny or repress our pain, it in fact becomes more painful because our hardened heart compels us to work against the interests of our true selves as eternal, wise, joyful beings. It is the pain of not allowing ourselves to be changed by our losses. And this increases our feelings of isolation and loneliness, which leads to our inability to create and sustain heart connection relationship with Krishna and all living beings. So when we don't honor our losses, the grief accumulates and expresses itself in all sorts of ways like depression, chronic anxiety, mental and physical illnesses, and addictive behaviors. So we must become an active participant in our healing and have the courage to move towards rather than away from our pain, which will ultimately lead to the healing of our wounded hearts. But sadly, our society often encourages us to prematurely move away from grief. And the result of this is that we either grieve in isolation, hide our feelings, or attempt to run away from it in various ways. While the outward expression of grief is a requirement for healing, overcoming society's powerful messages that we should repress our feelings can be really, really difficult. People who express their grief outwardly are often viewed as weak or crazy or just on the mental platform. And this subtle message is to suck it up and get on with our lives. And far too many people view grief as something to be overcome rather than experienced. These messages, unfortunately, encourage us to repress our thoughts and feelings about loss and death and prevent us from crying our tears. Refusing to allow tears, suffering in silence, and being strong are often considered admirable social behaviors. If we receive little or no social recognition related to our pain, we will probably begin to fear that our thoughts and feelings are abnormal or even crazy. Honoring our pain and the pain of others is not self-destructive or harmful. It is self-sustaining and life-giving. We are not used to viewing grief and the need to openly mourn as something to honor. Yet the capacity to love requires that we mourn our losses. And so flippantly saying to grieving persons that they need to suck it up and get over themselves was not Krishna's mood when he was helping Arjuna cope with his grief before the battle of Kurukshetra. It is our poor imitation and misrepresentation of Krishna's words and a symptom, in fact, of impersonalism and sahajism to shame people for what they're feeling. Using philosophy to dismiss, judge, or further harm another person is a form of religious abuse. It means to use God talk to justify our lack of concern for another's suffering. This is a complete misunderstanding of bhakti. We did not see this attitude or behavior in the personality of Lord Chaitanya, who embraced lepers in front of the Jagannath Puri temple when the Brahmins spit on them for stepping on their shadow. Nor did we see it in the personality of Srila Prabhupada, who used to cry to see the suffering of so many people bewildered by the modes of passion and ignorance. Even Haridas Thakur did not shame or offend the prostitute who tried to seduce him by calling her a whore or some kind of lowlife. Rather, he compassionately invited her to sit down and wait until he finished his rounds before tending to her needs. So it is true that an enlightened person understands that as a spiritual soul, we do not die with the death of our body, and that we have the potential to transcend even the most trying bodily or mental conditions. However, being aware of this truth is not an invitation for anyone to be uncaring to themselves or other living beings. Rather, it's a call for us to be merciful in the same way that Krishna is merciful to us. Krishna says in the Bhagavatam that it's a gentleman's greatest duty to be compassionate upon a person who is distressed. And this is the duty of anyone who professes to be a devotee of the Lord. Our personal belief system can have a tremendous impact on our journey of grief. We may discover that our religious or spiritual life deepens or changes as a result of a significant loss. We may even find ourselves questioning or doubting our beliefs. When someone or something we love dies or is lost, it may make us feel very close to God, or it may make us feel more distant or even hostile towards God for a while. We may find ourselves asking questions like, why did this happen to me? Why is God punishing me? Or how can I find meaning from what has happened? We may find answers to all our questions about our faith, but we may not. And when we experience a significant loss, it is natural to reevaluate our life based on this loss. In times like these, we need to have someone willing to listen to us without judging or advising us as we explore our religious and spiritual values, question our attitudes towards life, and renew our understanding of our purpose for living. When our hearts are torn apart, one of the most important needs we have is to nurture ourselves physically, emotionally, cognitively, socially, and spiritually. It is also helpful for us to remember that this world is a place of suffering, as Srila Prabhupada advises us in his purport. The entire universe is full of miseries, and therefore the inhabitants of this material universe are always shedding tears out of intense grief. There is a great ocean of water made from such tears. But for one who surrenders unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the ocean of tears is at once dried up. One need only see the charming smile of the Supreme Lord. So as our broken hearts gradually heal, we will notice that this sharp, ever-present pain of grief will give rise to a renewed sense of meaning and purpose. Even though our feelings of loss will not completely disappear, they will soften, and the intense pangs of grief will become less frequent. The journey through grief is life-changing, and we are forever transformed by our experience. We may be more patient or more sensitive to the feelings and circumstances of others, especially those suffering from loss. We may have new insights that guide the way we live our new life. We may have developed new skills and attitudes. We may have regained a new sense of inner balance. We may explore our assumptions, our values, and priorities in life. We may ask ourselves, why did I waste my time on these things? After our transformation, we may value relationships more than material things. We may embrace and creatively express our newfound potential. Grief work is really hard work. It is soul work. Nourishing our grieving soul is a matter of surrendering to the mystery of grief and the mystery of life. Real learning comes when we surrender our need to compare our grief, surrender our self critical judgments, surrender our need to completely understand everything. And as we continue to experience how grief has transformed us, we need to be open to the new directions our life is now taking by listening to the inner voice of Super Soul, being intentional to make choices that are aligned with what we have learned on our grief journey. The soul has many secrets. They are only revealed to those who want them. And one of the best kept secrets, and yet hidden in plain sight, is that in order for there to be new life, renewal, and recreation, there also has to be death, loss, disorganization, and deconstruction. And this pattern is obvious in all aspects of nature, from the changing of the seasons to the cycle of life that governs not only living creatures, but also organizations and relationships. So spiritual growth is not an in destination. Rather, it is a dynamic, ongoing process that continues eternally. Even a pure devotee's love for Krishna grows more and more. And so we end this presentation, how it began, with a reflection on the absolute truths of life in the form of time, change, loss, and inevitable grief. The natural, normal, necessary process of ensuring that we continue to grow towards greater health and wholeness as eternal, wise, joy-filled beings. So I will end with this quote by a grief doula and clinical psychologist, Dr. Mia Hentenye. Grief is love. It's present when our heart breaks open, when we allow ourselves to open to the flow of life. Sometimes it pierces the heart so intensely. Sometimes it unfurls the heart so gently. Often it brings up all the unresolved trauma from the past, which makes it overwhelming to contend with if we are not skilled in her ways. Cultivating a devotional practice is to carve out time every single day to pay attention to the emotional signals and make space for the movement of its energy and the whispers of the heart. Grief is healing. It is love. It is not the shadow, but the thing that liberates us from bearing the weight of what has not been loved. It is the salve that brings relief when we realize that there is nothing in this material world to hold on to, so we can finally let go the current of love waiting to carry us forward, back home, back to our eternal relationship with Krishna, our eternal friend. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, RAMBHORU. That was really, for me, just to listen to was extremely transformative. And I think some of our viewers share my experience, judging from the comments that they have shared. One thing that really struck me, what you said in the beginning, is that grief is not just a feeling. Sometimes we have this common tendency of saying to others, or maybe we've have this experience and others say this to us, that we should just get over it. Like maybe you're irritated and you can just get over your irritation, or you're a little bit hungry and someone will say, just eat something and get over it. But I think grief is something much bigger than that. As you said, it's an experience, both mentally, emotionally, but also physically. And then ultimately there's a message for the soul. And so many things that you said really stood out for me, but one thing but for me personally, it really touched me, is when you said, when we experience loss, we don't have to think that we're going to just get over it. We can acknowledge that now that we've experienced this loss, our life is never going to be the same again. But then we can move beyond that. But for me, that was very comforting, because if I think about some of the major losses I've experienced in my life, one of the things that really hurt me was people saying to me that, it will be all right. Everything will go back to normal. Your life will continue as it was before. And I think we intuitively feel that that's not true. Because as you say, everything ultimately, people, situations, everything has a life, and then it's moving towards death. and we've got to acknowledge that loss. And one last point I wanted to make, and I'm aware that Dee has a question she wants to ask, and I find this very interesting. I recently read that having a broken heart can actually manifest as a physical symptom. They call it
Yeah.
broken heart syndrome. And
Yeah.
it's very interesting, and it says that it is caused by acute stress, but it has like physical, symptoms,
Yes.
like for instance, weakening of the heart walls, actually like you've got some bleeding in your lungs, like very severe symptoms, all
Yes.
caused by a broken heart.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Yes. When we are grieving, grief actually rests on our lungs. So it's very interesting. A lot of the grief, COVID cases are with elders who are often very sad, grieving. There's so much loss, and it's a lung thing. But also, we somatize if we are not processing those grief feelings. They come out to try and get our attention through illness, anxiety, depression, all those things. To get our attention in some way. Yeah.
Thank you, Prabhu. I just wanted to share something Murray Bell has posted in the Facebook chat. She says, recently I have felt lots of pressure from my peers to be quicker on my spiritual journey. Others unknowingly have done the spiritual bypassing, and I too was bypassing my grief somewhat. Your words are so welcome to my heart. So I just thought I'd
Oh,
share
thank you,
that
Mary.
sort of lovely offering to you,
Yeah.
which also leads to my comment, because my question to you really, and you mentioned at the start that healing, grieving is the process for healing the heart, which is a very powerful thing. We talk about, like Sharadia mentioned earlier, about broken heart, being broken hearted, and how grieving is the process that heals that broken heart. So my question really is that, how can, what tips do you have, because you've got a wealth of experience in this process in a professional capacity and from a sort of spiritual capacity. So how can we process grief so that you can turn this grief into something that is a transformative and an empowering experience? Because you mentioned earlier, it's very easy to wallow in your own grief and self-pity. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be compassionate about it, but at some point, one, when it's the right time and the right way for that individual, one needs to move on, isn't it? At some point, maybe I've got it completely wrong, but how can we, because it's such an in-depth topic, but how can we use these very traumatic or very challenging situation, to be an empowering and a transformative experience?
Yeah. Well, there's some needs, and needs of mourning, and there's it requires you to be intentional about going through what we call the wilderness of grief. And time doesn't heal it. You just shove it, you just swallow it all back in. It gets stored away somewhere. And it's considered or recommended to what we call dose, like you take a dose of medicine, not to try and uh, uh, process that all at once. So what we do is we have grief support groups, which are safe places where you can reach out and you can share on a weekly basis, a 90-minute small group from 6 to 8 people, maximum of 10, facilitated process. And in my grief support groups, we have a textbook that we use that anybody on this call can probably find as a free PDF called Understanding Your Grief. I have the second edition, and if you want to buy the book, you can go to centerforloss.com. And Alan Wolfeld, who is one of the most prolific writers on grief, has books for children. How do you navigate children who've lost a family member, their mother, father, whatever, a spouse, divorce, suicide loss. I do suicide loss groups for people and communities who someone has died of suicide. That's a little bit different, but it's really, really, really helpful in healing and integrating, is to, at least for 12 weeks, to join a grief support group and have your go through an intentional process where you're just parking all of that 90 minutes a week, so you're not all the time trying your mind and heart knows every week for 90 minutes I'm going to give myself the freedom to cry and talk and be with other people, and having friends, finding people who really can listen without judging and advising. The sad reality is, for a grieving person, there's three types of people. Either the people are helpful, that means they support you, affirm you, validate you, or they're toxic. They're the ones who say, suck it up, get over yourself, you're Maya. And I'd stay away from those people. And then there's sort of neutral people who are kind of, we don't even care. We're so neutral, we don't even notice that you're grieving. So finding those people, even one or two, who understand and are willing to let you talk about your grief. If you're not feeling safe or don't have anyone, keeping a journal is super helpful. This Alan Wolfeld's Understanding Your Grief book comes with a journal for every touchstone or chapter. So you could, if you wanted to, do this process on your own. However, it's super, super helpful to have other people going with you on that journey. But you could get the book and the journal and just start writing about what your feelings are. It will help very much knit your brain and heart together and help you integrate. Something people don't realize is that we don't often, when we experience a sudden loss, really accept it as a reality. Our head accepts it in the beginning. If somebody's died, I've lost my home to a tornado, I've lost a body part, they cut off my leg or my arm. Brain may go, yeah, sure, I know that happened. But it takes a really long time for the emotions to catch up. So learning how to deeply accept the loss and come to terms with it is one of those needs, being able to express one's feelings in some way. So it might be through some creative art. You might be an artist drawing your pain in paintings, singing, ritual, even, worshiping the deity, creating jewelry, anything that help you create and express your feelings of grief outwardly. They're super healing and helpful. Yeah. Of
Thank
course.
you so much. I've got a question from a viewer on YouTube, Amanda. So she's asking, thank you so much for an affirming presentation. How does one process grief that seems somehow linked with guilt, whether the guilt is justified or not?
Yeah. Well, of course, I don't know the context of the guilt, but it's very often that the surviving person feels somehow if they had done this or that, that's a real common. Like if you are a mother and your child died and you didn't get him to the hospital, they died before they got to the hospital, saw coming. There's always this feeling, I could have done more. That's just completely a natural, normal. And knowing that is a typical grief response, whatever the case is, even if you, even if it's true, you should have yesterday taken your daughter to the doctor, or your husband to the doctor, or still things happen as they happen, and being able to just come to terms with the awareness that also God's in control. We're not the supreme controller, and there is something beyond us that's orchestrating even our heartbeats, and even at the moment of our birth. It says in our scriptures that the number of heartbeats that we're destined to have is already programmed like a battery. Yeah. So that kind of helps, to know that Mare Krishna Rake Krishna Mare Krishna. If God wants to kill you, no one can save you. If God wants to save you, no one can kill you. So you're not the doer, but we often feel that. It's a natural emotion to feel guilty. Just be compassionate on yourself. Yeah.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. So I have a question in relation to something that you mentioned a couple of times. You mentioned that, in a response, for instance, if someone, is very insensitive towards another one that is experiencing, a great loss, you said that many responses could be toxic. And you also mentioned, when we use verses, say we would use verses from Shastra to put others down or to criticize others because of their mourning, it's actually religious abuse.
Yes,
So
it is.
I wanted to ask if you could give us some more examples so that we can be conscious, to identify religious abuse, but that we can also be conscious ourselves that we don't engage in religious abuse, or that we aren't actually, being those toxic people ourselves. Because sometimes when certain things, become part of the institutional culture or the organizational culture, we might be engaging in those behaviors without even being aware of them.
Right. Well, to be simple and clear is that any comments or behavior or attitudes that we have other than compassionate care of a person who's hurting is religious abuse. That is just very simple. These instructions in scripture are for us. I might say about myself, I'm really in Maya. I might say, oh gosh, I'm really overwhelmed. I can say those things about me. You can't. If I say them to you about you, that's offensive, right? And so, especially in terms of someone whose heart is broken and hurting, um, to take scripture out of context and dismissing or not honoring the pain of another person is abusive. So we can help ourselves by learning some skills, learning some active listening skills. In my chaplain training program with my Karuna Care students and my professionals, we start with four little skills. There's so many, but one is just learning open-ended questions. Asking, inviting a person to express and explore their feelings. You can say, like in my listening circle that met right before this, we go around in our circle and we say, okay, what's on your heart today? Or what's giving you anxiety today, but what's on your heart today? So people then just share, this is my challenge, or maybe you're feeling some blessing. And then affirmations, to be able to validate. No, it's called OARS, OARS, open-ended questions, affirmations, which means validating. Maybe, gosh, it's so courageous of you to even be willing to, or I'm so honored that you would like to share with me, to validate. Gosh, I'm surprised after what you've gone through that you're even at the temple today. That's amazing, being sensitive. OAR, reflecting back the feelings that you hear. Sometimes people are expressing feelings, but they're not even using a feeling word. I don't know about South Africa, but the United States, our English is so devoid of feeling words that when I say the word I feel, there's no feeling word like sad, mad, glad, afraid behind it. So I might say, I feel like a cup of hot chocolate. I was like, I don't know how hot chocolate feels, or I feel like going for a walk. What does that feel like? We don't even use vocabulary that can express our heart. And so being able to reflect back, somebody is describing a feeling, to be able to name, sounds like you're frustrated, or sounds frustrating, or it sounds really sad. Tell me more about that. And just keep person talking, inviting them. And because often, if you come to a person and you say, well, I'm here to listen to your problems. Do you have a problem to let me hear? And people are like, no, I'm not going to share my problems. I don't want to dump on you, right? You wouldn't. But to help people get a sense that I care about you, and tell me, I'm here to listen. I care about you, you know, and rather than to make a person feel guilty or ashamed that they're now dumping their feelings on you. And finally, summarizing, to be able to, especially near the end of a conversation, to be able to let a person know you've actually heard what they're saying, or to clarify, did I get that right? Now this is what I've heard, did I get that right? And to encourage them to clarify and help you understand what they're saying, because everybody wants to be heard, but it's more than just going nodding and going, uh-huh, uh-huh. I mean, anybody can do that, but that doesn't mean that you're really listening, right? So if you repeat back some of the things you've said to a person, then they can trust, I've been heard. It's so wonderful to feel seen and heard by another person, because most people are on their cell phones, or they're looking at the window, or they're picking their nose or something.
Mm.
Yeah, it's yoga. It's yoga practice, listening. Mm.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. What I really heard there is that I think starting of ourselves, we need to be able to identify and express our feelings. And then when connecting with others, instead of maybe first thinking we should instruct them or even help them, we should just hear them and see if we can identify, their feelings. And I find it very instructive. There's this pastime in the Mahabharata. It's also in Srimad Bhagavatam, and we know that Dronacharya was the martial arts teacher of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, but we're also
Mhm.
aware that his son went on to slaughter all the sons of the Pandavas. And
Yeah.
then there was this there was this question about what is the right course of action to deal with him. And I think Krishna actually told Arjuna that he should be killed, but then Draupadi said to Arjuna that he should not be killed because she was feeling the pain that it would cause his mother, Kripi. So it's very interesting. Our Prabhupada writes in Srimad Bhagavatam, it's the first canto, 7th chapter, verse number 49, purports. He writes, the feeling of equality was there because Draupadi spoke out of a personal experience. A
Yes.
barren woman cannot understand the grief of a mother.
Yes.
Draupadi was herself a mother, and therefore her calculation of the depth of Kripi's grief was quite to the point. It was
Yes.
glorious because she wanted to show proper respect for a great family. So I find it interesting because Prabhupada is actually glorifying Draupadi for having that compassion
Yes.
for not even her grief, but the grief that she could experience. So I thought this is, I don't know if you want to make any comments about this, but I thought this is very insightful how Prabhupada is praising. I mean, he didn't have the vocabulary of, that we're using now, like empathetic listening or, these words, but Prabhupada is basically glorifying that level of sensitivity to others.
That's absolutely true. In other places in our scripture, it talks about how a person who has suffered does not wish suffering, that level of suffering on others. But interesting too is that in chaplaincy, that's the main credential, is that you've suffered. You can't do this work unless you have known significant suffering. Most people who come to this profession are because they've had a transformation due to a significant loss or maybe multiple losses. And so part of their own healing is to be a caring presence to others. It's so self-healing as well as it provides healing for other people too. Yeah, it's amazing.
So one thing that occurred to me is we spoke about obviously being compassionate towards others and actually allowing that allowing individuals going through traumatic or you know experiencing loss to kind of process that, going through that, repairing your broken heart. However, we can see time and time again that when people often go through these difficult times, then often unawares they become stuck in grief, so much so that it becomes their identity. So in your experience, in the field of work you operate in, how, what examples have you seen, and why do people often get stuck in grief, and what can we do to support people to kind of get unstuck almost?
Well, often we call that complicated grief. There are many terms for that. Ambiguous loss, for example, if the person, the loss is they're surrounding it some trauma like suicide, and they have an image in their mind of they were there when it happened, or somebody dies and they never got to say goodbye, someone gets lost or goes missing, and you for the rest of your life you're wondering, that kind of thing. Then it's recommended, and Alan also has he has some books about even post-traumatic stress, which is really underneath that. It's a complicated grief issue. um, but it's a good idea to work one-on-one with a specialist, somebody who can give you, instead of sharing 90 minutes every week with a group, you're having 90 minutes a week working specifically on telling that story and being able to be in touch. A lot of the stuckness is, again, avoidance of of being able to sink down into that pain. And that's what post PTSD is really about as well, is that I can't I can't sit a minute, in the present moment with this pain that is always present. So we're always distracted with this word addiction. We go to food addiction, drug addiction, sex addiction, even internet addiction. All of those things is to keep us in future or past and not being able to sit in the present. And this is why chanting Hare Krishna, all these devotional practices are there to bring us in the present moment. And so, it may be in the beginning, even breathing, learning how to ground ourselves by, breathing and activating the polyvagal nerve, which is in the center of ourselves. Gosh, in under a minute, if you do deep breathing, that can bring you back to the present. But every psychologist knows who works with someone who's dissociated due to not being able to tolerate the pain, emotional pain. They first start with them by helping them stay in the room. Before I can even talk to you, I need you to be present. I don't need you spacing out all over the place. You need to get present with yourself. So chanting the holy name is huge therapy for us. We all come from a very dissociated environment in Kali Yuga, where there's distraction. So deity worship, singing, everything we do in devotional life is really a meditation. So it's a wonderful way to get connected to the Lord in our heart and learn how to tolerate the pain or transform it. In fact, trauma specialists now have acknowledged that not just breathing, but vibrating sound is the most powerful meditation. So we've got that built into our bhakti practice through chanting Hare Krishna mantra. This is really powerful. Yeah.
No, that was very helpful. Thank you so much. A following question, it's sort of thing that you mentioned earlier was also that, sometimes, people get stuck in grief and, going round and round in circles, which could be difficult to get out of. But
Yeah.
what can we do if some people may not have that supportive environment, that enables you to do that sit and think? Because if you think about it, if it's a big trauma that's, sort of impacted an entire family, for instance, when you're not having that sort of, to be situated in the present situation, or situated in a good place, you also need that environment. So if you don't have that with you, what can you do to kind of help you be situated, so to speak?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, that makes grief is already complicated, and it's very individualized and unique. But now if a person is stuck, and we have to really figure out, what do you mean by stuck? I mean, it can take years for a person to finally, get able to cope. It might be 2 years even. I think the marker is to identify, does a person, do they have regular sleep habits? Often when a person has complicated grief, they can't sleep at night, or they sleep all the time. That's one of the markers. Or they can't eat. They're just so stressed they can't eat, or they eat all the time. So it can either way, right? So as a person starts to reconcile and heal their grief, their habits, life habits, eating habits, sleeping habits, work habits become back to regular. You can notice it. And there's some in Alan's book, there's a whole list of signs that you're actually coming out of this forest. But it can take a long time. And the most powerful thing for anybody is to be surrounded by caring and loving people who are not shaming, judging, pushing you, and keeping you safe. Because if you get too stuck too long, often you can move to something like chronic depression. There's situational depression, which could be that you don't have sunlight or you're bored with your work. That's easily overcome. But when it becomes chronic and you're thinking of suicide, you're having suicidal ideations, then that's a kind of a red flag for you to get help. And if you have people around you who are hearing you speaking like that, that's a real red flag to get more help. But either way, it's just super important to have people to support you in your life, if you can even have one or two people. Now, it's really hard for the people supporting you. If it's like a constant, we talked about this yesterday, and we talked about this the day before, and so it can be really helpful to have a team, a family who's aware. Maybe they are reaching out to consult their hotlines you can go to if you have nobody to talk to, even a suicide hotline, the people on the other end of it, even if you're not really contemplating killing yourself, they are used to handling super depressed people, you know. So there's resources out there on our website. We have an international like connections for hotlines in India, in Australia, different places. You can look at it locally, Google it, and find things. Um, there's also something called the Global Healing Circle, which is a free online. You can be trained as a healing circle leader, facilitator. I've done the training, but you can just show up. They have all kinds of groups, and you put yourself on a wait list. They have ones for grief, for art, using art, like art therapy for grief. And it's a wonderful safe space where they guide you, and you have a space to be supported and to share your feelings. That's something that's free. Um, yeah, but the best thing is to try, if you're stuck like that and you're so irregulated and having panic attacks, is to reach out to a professional if you can, a grief specialist. Yeah, not just a counselor, someone who's specializing in grief. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I think one thing which is really standing out to me, Prabhu, is that understanding grief and understanding how to embrace our grief, it sounds like we actually really need some training for this, which is something we definitely do not. I think the majority of us would not necessarily receive this from our parents, even if they're well intended.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not something we even touched upon in school. Or I mean, I work in education, and I'm not aware of any mainstream education which goes into this. And I suppose that's why you also called your your initiative Karuna Care Education,
Yeah. Yeah.
to really train people
Yeah.
and bring this awareness, give them the tools, give them also the vocabulary to speak about these things.
Yeah.
So this is
It's a
yeah,
language.
this is amazing, and I'm really hoping more devotees will be inspired to take your courses and to get involved. We are sharing the links in the chat about Karuna Care, and I want to move on to another question. Now, I think maybe not our listeners, but maybe other devotees who have not been exposed to the work that you do. When we have conversations with them, they might still have this idea that a Vaishnava does not actually grieve, or a pure devotee does not grieve. And I find this quite interesting, because I found this quote from Prabhupada, and I want to share it. So Prabhupada says, this means that these things, the sentiments, anxiety, grief, anger, all things, they are constant companion with the living entity. You cannot give it up. However, when they are used for Krishna, that is perfection.
Yes.
So then someone might say, all right, but Prabhupada can, maybe it's different for Prabhupada because Prabhupada was a pure devotee. And I found it very interesting. I found several letters in which Prabhupada actually use the word grief. And here's one example. It's a letter to Yamuna, 5th of January 1968. And he says, if you have any specific grievances, please let me know. So he uses that word. And then again, when he writes to Yadurani, 26 October 1967, he says, my grief for Kirtananda isn't anything personal, but I'm sorry that he's become a Mayavadi. And he's also written to one of his god brothers, Shauman Miraj, in 15 January 1969. And then he says, I'm much aggrieved to learn the news of our revered god brother, Swami Bhakti Sadhaka Nishkinchana Maharaj, and I'm so glad to hear he passed away in the full sense of chanting Hare Krishna. So now my question is, we hear here that Prabhupada is expressing, that he is feeling grief. But what is the difference between Prabhupada's grief and our grief? And how can we move from, as Prabhupada says, because we can't come away from grief, but how can we move from where we are at to actually experiencing our grief in relation to Krishna, which I'm assuming that's more how Prabhupada was experiencing his grief.
Well, it's a maturing process, you know. The thing that we do is we are often reacting to our anxiety. People don't know that. You know, fighting when we have this eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. Defending is not just physical survival needs, but it's also our ego. We're defending our ego, our face, saving face. So we want to become aware in terms of Krishna consciousness of what's coming up when I find myself getting angry. You know, I'm getting triggered. Why? Or I find myself judging someone, or I find myself intimidated or freezing. So fight, flight, freeze, or I'm groveling because what is the anxiety there? Because it's always anxiety. It's a fear of survival, either my ego or my body. So starting there to become aware of my responses and how much I'm defending against the sadness underneath or the feelings of grief. So anger, often if you look at it, is underneath, it's coming from hurt. Like you step on a dog's tail, he may growl and want to bite you. And really underneath that is a loss of safety. So when you find yourself defending and being angry, you might want to go, God, you're really upset. What is up? What is that about? What is the loss here? Have I a loss of respect, a loss of dignity? Have I lost my shame? Do I feel ashamed? What is that? And then moving from the anger to, once you acknowledge, oh, this is a grief issue. It's always grief, whatever it is, those feelings are there. So instead of trying to go, no, I don't want to feel that, I'm going to run away, I'm going to avoid it, I'm going to be angry, I'm going to judge everybody, just recognize this is a moment where I'm going to sink down into it and let myself feel it now. And just be with it, because it comes and goes. And what it does when we can feel our pain is it starts to chip away that stone-like heart. The tears will come who have been sitting there forever. And, Prabhupada told me when I was on a walk with him, when I was in Vrindavan in 1976, and he said, if one can just tap into one little drop of love in our heart, the whole floodgates will come out. But if our heart is all the time defending itself against this feeling of cracking our heart, then we'll never feel the love that's actually in our hearts. Because who we are is Satchidananda. We are eternal beings of joy and wisdom. But if you're all the time, I don't want to, it's because you have to it's a rebirthing, it's a deathing and chipping away, and the heart cracks open. So it's painful, just like having surgery on your tooth or something. But if you sit with it and trust, okay, I may cry for a day. Maybe I have to wrap myself up in a blanket. Sometimes I do that when it's like, oh, this has been a really hard day. I'm going to get in my sleeping bag and take a nap, And you'll see as time moves forward, it shifts, the pain shifts. And generally, there's a new insight if you stay with it rather than running away, medicating it, eating, opening the refrigerator to see if God's in the refrigerator or whatever. Krishna will start speaking to you. The more you chip away and you learn to accept and open and embrace rather than defend against it, your heart becomes bigger and softer. And now, instead of judging yourself and other people, you can have compassion on yourself and others, because you know what that feels like. You recognize in other people they're struggling with whatever the behavior is, oh, they're anxious. So if you're talking to somebody, say, who's really upset and they're angry, and you're like, normally you would be going, ew, get away, judging them because you haven't done that work. But now that you recognize, oh, they're not feeling safe. Otherwise, why would they be defending themselves? Let me try to create safety in this moment. And just by you recognizing that and breathing into it, you impact their anxiety and bring them back to peace. It's very powerful, how we can impact other people just by our consciousness in our presence. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think you really helped me to really reframe my understanding of our emotions, because I often think we misidentify emotions for either being an anartha in itself, or we sometimes misidentify, really tapping into our emotions as being in Maya. And I think the way you described it was basically saying we've got these anartas within our heart, which is kind of like a heart covering,
Hmm.
which is preventing us to connect with that pure love, which you said, like Prabhupada said, if we could just access that one drop of love. And the way you're describing it, it's almost like, the emotions, it's kind of like it is a pathway through that covering of the heart. But we've got to embrace the emotion and
Yeah.
really go into the emotion. And then through going with the emotion, it can help us go through these hard, coverings of the heart and actually tap in to that source. So that's a beautiful image
Yeah.
that
Prabhupada
you've
used to
given
say
to
that
us.
if a person can learn to be humble and honest, then all the purports of the Vedas will be revealed. So confronting, we're running away. That means we're cheating ourselves when we're cheating everybody else. If we can embrace what is, it's Bhagavad Gita as it is, not how we want it to be, life as it is, really take life on its own terms, the way Krishna is sending it, knowing that Krishna is tailor-made, making our pathway to freedom. But we have to go through this obstacle course. If we lean into it, then we will see that we become free. We become free and fearless in some ways, because we're naked, and that's really the meaning in the Krishna book of Krishna telling the gopis, you have to come out without your clothes. If you want to marry me, you have to come out naked. And that's a great metaphor for the soul. You have to come, if you want to have heart connection and union with the divine who's in your heart, in the hearts of all lovers, you got to come naked. You've got to take all those coverings off. The false ego has to come off, because Krishna's there. Come out if you want to marry me. It's a beautiful story. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think, it's like we covered it time and time again. It's, that acceptance of that grief rather than running away from it or denying it. And I think from personally, I could listen to you for hours and hours, but personally, I'll take away that point about when you mentioned grief is rebirthing, the process of rebirthing to get rid of what is no longer needed. I think is a very powerful thing you mentioned earlier, that it's so strong that could help people to that acceptance to let go of what no longer serves us. I
Yeah.
think is very, very powerful. And I know we're quite nearing the end, but I'd love to share some thoughts from the viewers on Facebook and
Okay.
YouTube. Dear Manjuali mentions, thank you, dear Ramboru, for your inspiring and thoughtful presentation. We learn so much about ourselves as we journey through grief to healing. It can be a gift indeed. Deep gratitude. And also, Rajalila Dixon mentions, my dear Rambura Prabhu, thank you so much for this podcast and all the educational programs you offer on Karuna Care. And I'll lastly share what Michelle Stanfield Wells shares with us, saying, it's always been odd to me that we understand the path and practice of bhakti to be personal and philosophically, yet many in leadership positions or as educators regularly shut down aspects of acknowledging grief,
Mhm.
suffering, pain, which often come from some form of oppression, aggression, and violence of one form or another from others or ourselves. I'm happy that you're championing this change. So there were some beautiful thoughts and comments. Thank you very much for everybody that's left comments today or and for your questions. One quick question that we had from Harini Priya I'd like to put to you. Was that how do we set up bereavement service for our devotees locally? Is there a care model that we can roll out?
Well, I'd be really cautious just telling people I don't know, who I haven't trained, to just open a bereavement thing. It's not as simple as that. But if you want to get some training, their courses online. I'm also, I have some devotees who I've been working with who are getting ready to do their own grief support group facilitation. But I can also send you back people who, wherever you are, if you want to start learning about it. Alan Wolfeld has also a support group facilitator guide that goes with that Understanding Your Grief book and journal. I would recommend people getting the second edition, which means you'd probably have to pay for it, but it's probably free or cheap online too. But I think the new edition has some extra stuff in it. But it's a wonderful guide, to guide people through a 12-week. It's very crafted. We've added to it in our groups. We've added art. We have the devotees who come to the group. They draw their feelings. It's another way of expressing, talk about it. They break out in groups. We share. They do journal questions and stuff. And I think it's a really good model. But I would not endorse that unless someone has a little training, because you're not only as a facilitator navigating people's anxieties and their feelings. You have to be aware of their safety. If somebody is suicidal, you need to screen people a little bit to see whether they need professional help, and you need to navigate the conversations so that everybody's not talking over each other at once. This is an art and science to that. So I wouldn't just do that. But if someone is really interested to learn about this, first take the 3 introductory courses that are coming up. We have the Impact of Grief starting next Sunday. And you need to do, before I will consider anybody in our practicum, take those 3 intro courses. They're 4 weeks, 5 sessions. Everything's on Google Classroom, and we meet at the end of the week to just discuss and integrate whatever the Google. And then you may interview for 2023, possibly joining the practicum. We have about 20 students going through that right now. And it's intensive. You can ask them, like, oh my God, I signed up for this. It's hard work. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, RAMBHORU. And I think, as you said, that's very important. It's good if we have the intention to help others, but we should also have the skills and be equipped to help others. I think that is...
You can hurt people. Yeah, you can hurt people.
Yeah, definitely. So it's been very, I think, enlightening having this discussion with you, but I'm conscious of time, so we will need to conclude our session soon. I just wanted to, reflect on what one of our viewers was sharing. Michelle was sharing that sometimes, although we have a personalist philosophy, we tend to actually act in ways which are very impersonal, denying the person of the others. And I found a passage very instructive in this regard. It's again from Srimad Bhagavatam, 9th Canto, Chapter 11, verse number 16. And I think if we read these pastimes of the Lord with openness in our hearts, we might actually see the example of how the Lord relates to others. So this is Lord Ramachandra, and the verse says, after hearing the news of Mother Sita's entering the earth, the Supreme Personality of Godhead was certainly aggrieved. Although he is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, upon remembering the exalted qualities of Mother Sita, he could not check his grief in transcendental love.
Yeah. Yep. Plenty of emotions in our books.
So I find that is very instructive, and we don't see a verse following that. And then someone reminded Lord Ramachandra that he wasn't, that Mother Sita hadn't really left him, and she's internally his consort. There is no such, follow-up verse. There's just this acknowledgement that although he's the Lord, he is experiencing transcendental grief. So I think if the Lord is allowed to feel, then certainly, so are we. So, RAMBHORU Prabhu, is there any last final concluding remarks that you'd like to share with us? Any realizations? You said many beautiful words. I took many notes myself. Looking at all of it, I feel that I'll have to go through the session again to really absorb what you've shared. But do you have any last thoughts?
I would just encourage everyone to be the change they want to see in the world, of ISKCON. When you see somebody sitting on the side in a temple gathering or somewhere who's looking like they're lonely or maybe distraught, don't just discredit them or just think, oh, they must be in their head, they must be Maya. Go over and find out what's going on, and offer some presence, some company. It can change a life. It can save a life. If you reach out, often people are contemplating suicide because they're so isolated and lonely, and it can just take a word or a smile that can turn their life around. People are so lonely, and research shows that basically mental illness is caused by isolation and loneliness. So if we can somehow create heart connecting relationships, and I didn't talk about this, but I will say this now. Rupa Goswami's 6 loving exchanges, I realized there are really only 3. They're boiled down to 3 things that we can do. And basically, when we're talking about offering and giving gifts, the greatest gift we have is the gift of time. You can't give anything more wonderful to another person is your time. Also, offering and receiving prasadam is really about sharing a meal. So I would encourage, you all to find people in your community, create your own little sub community and share meals. Invite people to share a meal. While you're sharing a meal, share stories. This is a wonderful time to learn about each other. Gift, time, stories, and food. Those are the 3 eternal proverbial community builders that you will find in every culture. Sitting around a campfire, singing a song, sharing food, stories. It changes everything in the culture. We don't do that enough. So you all be the change you want to see in ISKCON.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I'll conclude with just saying that I think some, even when we advertised this episode, there's always some resistance from certain groups of devotees, and a lot of them are saying what you are speaking about is against our philosophy, but I would say it's actually the opposite. It's that's the implementation of our philosophy. It's the living of our philosophy that you are trying. This embodiment of our philosophy that you are trying to teach us. So to conclude, I just want to share a quote from you. I hope I paraphrase it correctly because I was jotting it down as you were speaking. So Mbura Prabhu early in the session, she said that we have to embrace the painful reality that we're all dying. And I suppose everything around us also dying. And then when we embrace that painful reality, we can realize that underneath all our losses is Krishna. Krishna is present and is waiting to fill the void which is caused by all our suffering. So to me, that was a beautiful quote from you, Prabhu.
Thank you.
Thank you
So
so much for joining us. And I would also like to thank everybody that sent questions, comments, and we really do appreciate everybody's support, feedback, and kind words. So do get in touch if you have any ideas about any future topics you wanted to cover, and any feedback and any comments will be very gratefully received. Thank you.
Haribo.